Hi, my name is Natércia, and today we're going to be talking about Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Since I only have about 12 subscribers, chances are you don't really know who I am, so let me just start really quickly by introducing myself. I love literature. I love academia, I love poetry. I really do have a deep appreciation for the arts in general, and it's something that I wanted to lean more into, hence why I created this YouTube channel. I started reading Les Misérables earlier this year. This book had been on my quote-unquote TBR for the longest time, and I said quote-unquote because more than a TBR, this had been a dream of mine. It had been on my life list, on my bucket list. I had actually written down that I wanted to read in its original language, hence why I've struggled with this little guy since January. Something important to note is that this is an abridged version of the original text. I am planning to eventually read this in English as the unabridged version and then later on move on to the unabridged version in French. I have a lot of thoughts about this book. Some of them are more positive and some of them are not so. Clearly, it's very important to note that this book is huge, and if I really wanted to make it justice in my critique, I'll have to write a multitude of essays and produce a great number of videos. I'm only making one video. Just a little disclaimer, we're not gonna tap into everything this book has to offer, but the things that I did want to talk about are here. I will be discussing first the context of the book, followed by its setting and the narration style. I have thoughts about that. I'll finally talk about the introduction into the main character, the unraveling of said main character's psyche, and I'll conclude by talking about the parallels that I found between Bishop, Jean Valjean, and Gavroche. So let's talk about the context. First of all, it's important to note that this is set in 1815. This is the same year that Napoleon I loses the empire. Prior to this, France had gone through an incredible period of social, political turmoil within its own land, but also abroad. France had been involved in several wars, which had led to incredible deficits. People were starving, people were struggling. About this same time, in the century prior to the 19th century, you have Enlightenment thinkers such as Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Voltaire. These are people who are pushing against the notion of absolute authority from the monarchy, and they're starting to have the conversation of maybe as human beings, we might just have certain rights, or rather because we are men. So all of this happens about a generation or two prior to the setting of the actual book. We've had a lot of poverty, we've had a lot of hunger and famine, we've had the French Revolution, and I think this is something that people often forget because we've seen the movie and we know that there are a number of protests happening, but the French Revolution happened in the prior century. This is important because this context allows us to better understand the circumstances that led Jean Valjean, our main character, to steal bread to feed his nephews and nieces. But we'll get to that a little bit later. A little bit more about context. This is Victor Hugo's magnum opus. It was published in 1862, and he was already an incredibly renowned author. He was a great poet, he had been involved in politics, he was one of the most influential thinkers of his time. So when the book came out, it sold out in a matter of days. Hugo was known for his progressive postures in social matters, for example, the position of women, which is something else that we'll see a lot of in the book. Something that I think it's very important to note is that while he was a devout Catholic in his very young years, he eventually goes on to reject the church. However, he remains a very spiritual person. And I think this is something that, again, shows in the book. The book, one of its main and most powerful themes is this fight, this tension, push and pull between mercy and justice. I do find it very interesting though, because religion is portrayed in such a positive light in this book, whereas his prior work of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, it seems that he's extremely critical of religion. But I also think that the difference, I mean, I haven't read The Hunchback of Notre Dame yet, but I think in Les Misérables, he does have this sense of appreciation for religion, but I would say it's religion in its most pure and unadulterated form, being kind and good and extending mercy, more so than religion as an organization. So, moving on to the setting and the narration style. As I said earlier, France had gone through an incredibly turbulent period. We see the main character, Jean Valjean, being released in the year 1815. We know that he's been performing very, very difficult manual labor for decades. I think it was 2 decades, but don't quote me on that. So that puts us back long enough to period of time in France where famine was a very serious thing. And so we know that his circumstances lead him to perform a criminal act in order to feed his family. Now, this is a very important point because ultimately Hugo's aim through Les Misérables is to convince the reader or help the reader understand just to what extent society is responsible in its members turning to crime or becoming ostracized. I've mentioned it before on our reel on my social media. Les Misérables is an essay. Its purpose is to help the reader move from a position of detachment to very real and intentional engagement. He is trying to make you understand that to a large extent, this is not their fault. And I think it's such an important topic and conversation to be had today. And so it's very interesting because this was published in 1862, yet is still a very relevant read in our time. Now, considering that is Hugo's objective, I would like to offer a little bit of a critique as to why I think that he fails at executing it. And it all goes down to the narration style. The work is narrated in third person omniscient. I think third person was the best way to narrate the work because there are so many characters that we're trying to follow. So being able to move from one character to the other can only really be done in third person. However, I take issue with the omniscient part. Hugo writes this book as if though he's telling us a tale. There's not a real sense of scrutiny. And so we're only able to get to know the character through the narrator. To give you an example, I'm reading Brandon Sanderson right now, and he writes in third person because he has so many different characters that he wants us to learn about and follow. However, the narrator, when he is following or telling the story of a particular character, inhibits the mind and heart of that character. So we see what they see, we think what they think. With Hugo, that's not the case. To be fair, he does have an amazing talent at being able to capture feelings. I don't think I've read someone who has this ability to truly convey emotion with the same degree of depth. You know, when sometimes we say things like, I just don't have the right words to express this, he can do that. Nonetheless, I feel like that would have been put to better use if he had let us truly come in contact with the character without feeling like the narrator was the intermediary. Very often he'll say stuff like, oh, you, my dear reader, must remember when he said this and that earlier. And then on top of that, he will digress and take you on these very philosophical and moral rumblings. I read, I think it was on Wikipedia, that, oh, here, I actually have a note of it. More than One quarter of the novel is devoted to essays that argue a moral point or display Hugo's encyclopedic knowledge, but do not advance the plot, not even the subplot. And I take issue with that because, again, like I read this and the prose is 10 out of 10. Truly, it's beautiful prose. And I mean, you can see all these things that I marked them because they are beautiful. However, there is also a lot of this is an essay on what I think about this and that. And my version was an abridged high school version. I think this is kind of what they will study in France as students. But you still get a lot of these rumblings and these essays. And I just feel that being the renowned author that he was at the time, he would have been successful just writing a compilation of essays that argued his point in, the place of society in creating criminals, in the criminalization of poverty, in making women and children disadvantaged. Make a compilation of those essays and publish that as your essays, and then have the book argue that same point without all that volume of just random thinking. I don't have a better way to explain it. I think this would have been much more effective, again, if he had had a compilation of essays arguing the point, and then this very accessible read where he really truly shows you what the characters are feeling and going through. Because you as the reader can only truly really connect and be invested in a story. This is just my experience, obviously. When you know the characters, when they are people that are real to you. And that's just something that I couldn't get with the book. It was a story. That's just how it was told. I thought that was a shame. I thought there was so much more potential there. And it also made me think about the following. I wondered, why was this book so well received at the time? I know that critiques at the time varied, but all in all, it was well received. I mean, it stood the test of time. It's one of the most popular and influential reads even today. So why was that the case when it's such a dense read? The style of writing is incredibly accessible, but again, it's just like you'll be reading about a character and then the narrator will suddenly go, this reminds me of, and he goes off and we don't see the character until like 10 pages later. Very weird. I've never read anything like that. And if I'm completely honest, I didn't love it. And I will never read a book like that again. I mean, I read this because it's a classic and it's something that I want to be versed in. It's a book that I want to be able to form an opinion in, but I wouldn't just pick up a random book from the library that was this kind of style. I just think I want to find it engaging and I just wouldn't care to finish it. And so it just made me wonder whether perhaps Victor Hugo was being pretentious in his writing style, or whether the readers were the ones being pretentious. When a great author comes out with a book that's supposed to be his magnus opus, we all want to feel like we can understand the text, we know what the point was, and so forth. Or maybe it was just the style of the time. I don't know. But also, I think I read I need to read more books of that time period, but I did read another novel and it wasn't like that. So yeah, that's my beef with Les Misérables. I just feel like the prose was really good. It had very accessible language. He had an amazing thesis. He had an amazing point that he wanted to make, but the narration just failed us and let us down. If you don't feel this way, I'd love for you to tell me why. I'd love for you to convince me and tell me otherwise, because maybe there's a sense of beauty and romanticism in this kind of writing style that I'm missing. Also, if you know of anyone else that writes like this, please let me know. Now, that's kind of the more disappointing aspect of the book, but I want to move past that and share with you one of my favorite parts of the book, something that I felt was beautifully executed, and that is the introduction of the character Jean Valjean. He comes walking into this town, and off the bat we see that he's incredibly worn down. His clothes are torn and he could be anywhere between 30 and 50. He just seems defeated. We don't know who this man is. We don't know his age. We don't know his name. We don't even know where he comes from. It is all a mystery. But he gets to this town and he goes into a hostel and asks for a place to sleep and eat. And originally he is well received, but immediately the owner of the establishment, after getting some information from, it seems, someone else, tells him that there's no room for him. So this character, the traveler, keeps pushing, and he expresses, hey, listen, I have money and I'm even happy to sleep in the stables. The owner of the establishment is just mean. He's just like, no, get out. Like, we have nothing for you here. Sorry, like, we're full. Sorry, we don't have food. And so he's like clearly lying to his face. And I maybe it's just because I'm sensitive, but I found that super hard to read, because I'm like, this guy's clearly hurting. Like, we don't know how long he's been walking for, but we know that he's hurting. We know that he's hungry. He just needs a place to sleep. He's happy to sleep with the animals in the stable. It was just really sad for me to read. So he moves on and goes to another establishment, and the same thing happens. So from this other establishment, he goes to the jailhouse, just looking for a place to sleep. And that part kind of broke me, because I was like, imagine how bad it must be that you feel like you have to go to a jailhouse to sleep. And even there, he was rejected, which is crazy, right? So he keeps on trying to find a place to sleep, knocks into this house. He sees through the window this really warm family scene, and he's hoping that he'll be able to be welcomed in. But all he gets is a rifle pointing at him. So again, he has to leave, find some obscure place, and he lays down, but then turns out there's a dog, and the dog bites him. And that's just really sad. He finally just kind of breaks down, and he's like, I'm not even an animal. I'm not even a dog. I'm less than a dog. Like, even the dog has a place to sleep, but I don't. Throughout the book, religion is obviously alluded to. It's not like religion as an institution is talked about, or like he makes a point for a particular religion at all. Again, it's more like the good principles of faith and kindness. This part also, as I'm talking about it, makes me think of the story of Mary when she goes to find a place to sleep and have her baby, and how she's also turned away from every place she's been to. Anyways, he basically just gives up, and eventually a woman kind of points him out to this house, and it's Bishop's home, which is really funny because it's like he looked for a place to sleep everywhere but like a church. And that part was crazy because he'd gone from having all this rejection and having society turn a back on him and not giving him a place to sleep or a piece of bread, to turning to quote unquote God. And here he's well received, right? The bishop is not God, but he encapsulates God's goodness in a sense, right? He's completely welcoming. And Jean Valjean knocks, and the bishop welcomes him in. He brings out his best plates, his best cutlery. He sets out the nicest bed for him. And the rest is history. I'm sure you've seen one of the many adaptations. But if you haven't, really long story short, Jean Valjean steals something and then he's caught. But when he's caught by the police and taken to the bishop acts like he gave those things to him. That's the moment when Jean Valjean's psyche begins to unravel. So there are a few pages where we learn about all this animosity he had pent up because of the treatment he had received over the years during that manual labor, just because he wanted to feed his nephews and nieces. They were going hungry. And it's very poignant of read because we learned that Jean Valjean was always a very well-natured human. And he's now turned into this really bitter and angry creature. Not a dangerous person by any means, just dark and heavy. And it's really sad. And this happens because of society. There's a beautiful passage here, and I should have looked it up before I started the video, but honestly, I'm sorry, I can't find it. But basically, the narrator Victor Hugo, he talks about how society is this monster that turned this being into this dark shadow. So when Jean Valjean has this moment of extreme and undeserved and not asked for goodness from the bishop, his psyche begins to unravel because he cannot reconcile the fact that he had lived these decades in absolute pain and rejection, and he had built up an image of the world as being cold and cruel, and society has just been monstrous. And yet there's this one person who's so good to him. And so he has this internal battle, he has this push and pull, he has this struggle for understanding how someone could extend such mercy. But ultimately, it was the bishop's mercy that saved him, that allowed him to change. And I just love that because it makes me think to what extent us as humans can change people's lives by virtue of being kind. We all have been victims to someone saying something mean, and we've all been the perpetrator as well. And we know that those things hurt, and we know just how much they can change our lives. But I don't feel we talk enough about how much we can change someone's life for the better, even the whole trajectory of their journey, when we are merciful and kind. So that was something that I definitely took away from this read, and it's something that it really changed my mind, and it really made me think about what I personally want to bring into the world as a Christian. And then to kind of wrap up this video, because this is getting long, I wanted to talk about something I haven't seen any writings of, but that would be the parallels between the bishop, Jean Valjean, and Gavroche, my three favorite characters. Gavroche is a very interesting character because he is a leader, even though he's a very young child. Something that stood out to me was the extent to which he was selfish. They lived at a time where money could slip out of your hands at any minute. And if you don't have money, then you die. You go to the streets and then you die. And that was the case for children too. If you had children and you couldn't take care of them, then you just send your kids to the street to try to live their best life, and obviously they will probably just die. And so even people with money, people who had resources, would have been extremely careful with said resources. Generosity wasn't something that was freely given, which I think is why it's so important to note Bishop's kindness towards Jean Valjean. But Gavroche parallels that kindness and does something very similar when he sees two young boys on the street, and he takes them in and shares with them his bread, where he sleeps, and so he's generous with his very few resources. And I thought that was really powerful. I thought that showed a character similar to that of Bishop's and Jean Valjean. I will be interested to know what your thoughts are on Les Misérables if you've read it. If you haven't read it but you've seen an adaptation, I will also be very interested to see what your thoughts are on that. I hope you enjoyed the video. I know I had a really good time talking about this. It's something I've been wanting to do for a long time. I think all in all that this was an important read. I wouldn't say it was the best read I've had. I don't know if I'd say it was a great read, but it's an important read for a number of reasons. It's an important read because it's a classic, and there are a lot of people out there who have opinions about this piece of work, who will tell you things about it. And I think it's important for you to be able to formulate your own thoughts about things that have such a weight on culture and even decision making sometimes. I did love and appreciate the prose a whole lot, and there are beautiful passages here that I want to go back to and maybe just reread the passages, just because they are really beautiful, truly. And Victor Hugo has a way of capturing feelings like no one else. But the narration style, again, let me down. All in all, yeah, sure, I'll recommend people to read it. I don't think I'll ever really quote unquote rate books or say I don't recommend a particular book unless it's really, really bad, because I think everyone has different tastes and everyone can get something out of different things. Just because I don't like a book, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad book or you might not benefit from it. So yeah, those are my thoughts. I hope I'll see you in the next video, and that's it. Miss you, love you, bye.